Hello and welcome to The Found Cause, where we found our cause and serve the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm Michael, the man behind the machine, and to my left, your right is...
Sebastian, the bookkeeper.
Say that backwards, whatever.
I got it. I got it, though. I knew it. I knew what you were saying.
It's been a while since you've been with me in person, Sebastian, with the Ronies flying around and other things like that. How are you feeling? How's it been? What's been going on these past couple days?
Not too much, Michael. I've been busy, studying Greek and researching Eastern Christianity, as you normally do, and
upcoming episode, by the way.
Yes, very excited for that. And also just got married, so
married? I've never heard of this girl. I wasn't even invited. Is it some coronavirus wedding?
No, not quite. Since it's the third one already, it wasn't that exciting.
Have you been divorced twice already? You were adding to the stats there?
No, not divorced.
But Sebastian, do I have to call the cops? Having multiple wives is illegal last time I checked.
I don't care what that law says. I only care what God's law says.
I wonder what God's law does say. All right, that's an intro. That's a wrap. As you might have guessed, Sebastian is not actually married to 3 people, nor even 1 person, nor am I. But today we're going to ask the question, polygamy. Can I do it? And it might be more interesting than you think. To put all minds at ease, we are not advocating for polygamy. That's not the point of the episode. So I want to put all minds at ease right there. But if you are a Christian who lives ever, you've probably heard, well, I don't know, maybe it's kind of an obscure thing, but I've heard it from atheists in particular, those who attack Christianity, who, amongst many things they don't like about the Old Testament or God's law or whatever, they will also say that Christians promote polygamy, and that, that's just reprehensible. I might... on the back foot, even before we even talk about what the Bible has to say about polygamy, look at history and think, what societies were monogamous? And then I think, the West, Christian Europe, the Jews in Christian Europe, not Islam, not East Asia, not South America, not Native Americans. Oh yeah, it's just Christians, just Jews and Christians were monogamous. So kind of an extremely terrible critique from atheists who equally promote promiscuity and all the rest of that kind of stuff, to be attacking the Bible for being polygamous. But I suppose they're getting at Christians for being hypocritical, if they're not being inconsistent themselves, and that Christians obviously promote monogamy and say that it's adultery to sleep with somebody who's married when you're married, right? That's outside of your marriage, or it's fornication to sleep with prostitutes while you're married, or whatever it is. Right? We promote monogamy, 1 husband, 1 wife. So isn't it hypocritical that the Bible has characters in it who are polygamists? They have multiple wives. Let's jump down the rabbit hole, because it's more interesting than you'd think. The kicker, the start of the episode is, 1, we're not advocating for polygamy, like I said before, but 2, the Bible actually doesn't say, thou shalt not commit polygamy, or whatever you might be looking for to just slam dunk this case. So it takes a little bit more effort. So me and Sebastian are going to do it. We're also going to talk about some of the practical implications of this talk, because you might be asking, who really cares? We all agree that monogamy is correct. It's not really a point of contention these days, nor in mainstream Christianity across the world. Of course, there's some sects of cults that have multiple wives. Islam, which we encounter more and more these days, allows for multiple wives, but not in the West, because of course the West restricts marriage to 1 man, 1 woman. However, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but marriage definitions have been changing all the time recently, and not only official marriage has changed, gay marriage and whatever else, also just ethics around sleeping around and who you sleep with and who you live with are completely not monogamous, right? Nobody really cares. Certainly the law does not care whether or not you have slept with multiple women or sleep with multiple women or call yourself married or whatever to multiple women. So they only care as far as you filing taxes and having the official marriage certificate. And so you can see a point in which the United States might recognize polygamy as just another thing, like many Islamic countries do. So that being said, we want to talk about what is polygamy, and then what does the Bible have to say about polygamy. So first things first, Sebastian, what is polygamy, and maybe some of the other gummies out there that might be talked about in this topic?
Sure. Greek. Everything is Greek,
Everything's Greek, yep.
Yes, everything is Greek these days. Polygames, it's polys is many, from
Greek?
No.
Polygon?
Yes, many shapes, and then many ages. Sorry, and then games is marriage. So many marriages.
Yes, and when we use the word, we don't just mean many marriages. Polygamy specifically refers to of one man having multiple wives, which is the vast majority of polygamy, multiple marriage cases out there. However, there are a couple
another
other
one.
me's. Do you want to talk about them?
Yes, polyandry. When andros means man, like a man, like you and I, and polys, many. So many men. That is when it's one woman with several husbands. Not as common, as you were saying.
Yeah, it's kind of hard logistically if you think about it. If you're really going to make something quote unquote stable work with polygamy, it's already hard enough. But polyandry, you don't even know who the children are unless you've got some sort of system where you're like it's one man for 1 month, and then another man the next month, and you're keeping real close track of when you get pregnant. Like it's going to be very hard for you to figure out the children is. Not to mention all the gender role violations that would be happening. For the record, we won't really be talking about polyandry on this episode, specifically because there is not a single instance of polyandry in the Bible. And every time a woman is sleeping with multiple men, she's considered a prostitute. So it's not even permitted. Whereas we'll talk about polygamy later, some one man having multiple wives, which it sounds like a double standard. But again, I'll talk to you what the text says. We want to be biblical Christians here. I want to show you what the text says. But yeah, polyandry is not permitted. Even this, I'll give it a brief example. When the Sadducees, who aren't strict in the scriptures, they want to trip Jesus up on some logic puzzle to show that there's no resurrection. They come to him with a scenario that they believe breaks the logic for the resurrection. They say when a man dies and he has no children, his wife is to be given to his brother, which is part of the law. Moses said this. Is what they say. And it is so part of the law. He's to marry his brother. Now, among us, there were 7 brothers, and the first brother got married and then died, and having no children, his wife was given to his second brother, and the second brother died, and the third brother, and so on until all 7. Then, lastly, the woman died. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? For they had all married her. And then, of course, Jesus says, you're mistaken. You don't know the scriptures or the power of God. And, in heaven, they'll be neither given in marriage nor married, but be like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, God is the God of the living, not the dead. Anyways, notice that the Sadducees come to him with a scenario. They don't say one woman with multiple husbands, because I believe they didn't. They brought him this scenario specifically because they didn't want Jesus to have the out, quote unquote, of being able to say, well, that's a sin. They all go to hell, right? So if it was polyandry, the woman having multiple husbands, I believe Jesus would have said it was some like weird adultery. Like I think they were thinking that he would say that it was some weird adultery. Like there'd be some excuse for him not having to allow them into the resurrection, the so-called resurrection that the Sadducees didn't believe in. And similarly, if the multiple husbands had married her like all simultaneously, right? There might have been some like weird inheritance law. Anyway, so they had to do it the way they did. They forced it to be a required marriage because of the law, and therefore it was a lawful multi-husband scenario. They could have asked, but they didn't, if a man has multiple wives, whose wife will she be in heaven? Or whose husband will he be in heaven? And I think the reason they didn't ask that is because they know that men are allowed to have multiple women, or, according to their beliefs, and that Jesus may have told them that. Of course, he wouldn't have, because we know Jesus' answer, but he may have told them, Sadducees were thinking, that the man would still be married to all the wives in heaven. And so they used the wife as an example because they knew that Jesus was not going to say that the wife was still married to all 7 husbands in heaven. So all that to say, we're not going to touch polyandry and more than that because it's clearly not allowed in the Bible. So what about polygamy, Sebastian? We keep alluding to the fact that the Bible may allow polygamy. What are some obvious... I mean, if you're a Christian, you've read through the Bible, you know that there are instances of characters in the Bible who are ostensibly good, amiable people having multiple wives. What are some instances of that, Sebastian, just to jog our memory?
Solomon, the most famous one with how many hundreds? Hundreds?
Yes, he had 700 total lovers. I think 300 wives, 400 concubines. I'm counting.
He's on the heavy end, on the extreme side.
And for the record, I mean, that one is explicitly called out in First Chronicles and Second Chronicles. I think even in First Kings and Second Kings, or wherever Solomon lines up, that the Lord judges him for this because the law explicitly stated that the king was not supposed to gather for himself many wives, quote unquote. But notice the law says many wives, not a single wife. So the king was permitted to have multiple wives, but Solomon overdid it. So I mean, that's an example we could all shoot down and say, okay, well, obviously Solomon was sinning in that, and he's judged for it.
Mm-hmm. And also, a quick side note as well, he was probably imitating several kings from from the neighboring kingdoms because they all tended to do that too. So.
You needed to have a lot of money to do it, so it wasn't like a super common thing. But yeah, Ramses the second, famous king of Egypt, he had multiple, like many wives, like 90 wives, something like that.
Yes, so you can get the idea that it was mostly rulers being able to do this. And then there's David, there is Abraham.
Yeah, so King David, the line of the Messiah, blessed be David, man after God's own heart. Not only does he have multiple wives, he's never called out for having multiple wives. It's never something that said, oh, David was judged for having multiple wives. Of course, Bathsheba, the wife that he steals from Uriah and then has Uriah the Hittite killed, that's a thing that's called out. But I want to quote, maybe we'll interweave this with quotes from the Bible.
Let's do it.
The judgment. So Nathan the prophet comes to David after Uriah has been killed, and Bathsheba is pregnant with David's son. And this is what he has to say in 2 Samuel. If I can pull it up. He says this. Then and he gives this analogy. There was a man with many sheep, and then he saw a poor man with only one sheep, and he loved that sheep, and then he killed the man and stole a sheep, right? And David's like, kill that man. That man's evil. Where is he? And I'm going to take him out. And then Nathan said this. He says, then Nathan said to David, you are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. And then why didn't you despise the word of the Lord? By doing what is evil in my eyes. You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your household because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So clearly, that whole scenario is bad, specifically because, the murder and the adultery. But notice, God says, I gave you your master's house, that's Saul's house, and your master's wives into your arms. So he actually delivered the riches of Saul, Saul's house and his authority and his wives into David's arms, which is considered our rich, people obviously, but it's considered riches of being a king. And he says, if all of this had been too little for you, I would have given you even more. And some translations even make this more obvious that God is saying, essentially, David, if you wanted another wife, I wouldn't have withheld it from you, right? Mm-hmm. But you went and took somebody else's sheep, right? Kind of just like the analogy that Nathan gives. This rich man had plenty of sheep, and God had, mixing the analogy with the actual reality. If David had wanted another sheep, God would have given him the sheep. Not that he needed another sheep. Clearly, he did not need another wife. Had plenty. All you need is one. For the record, we're not endorsing polygamy here, but he took, he took another. But God was permitting David to have these wives. In fact, he even delivered Saul's wives to David. So the question is, clearly, God is not. It's not a inherent sin to have multiple wives, is what I would argue. Now, some would disagree. I don't think it is the sin itself to have multiple wives. There's a lot of caveats to that, and we're going to go through in this episode because we're not going to leave you on that. Again, we're not promoting polygamy, but you have to wrestle with the actual text, the actual reality of what God has done, and David's not the only example. So there's David, and you can see that God, at the very least, glosses over the fact that David has multiple wives and doesn't call it out. He only calls out the sin in the whole Bathsheba Uriah incident. Sorry, I interrupted you. We had Solomon, David, Abraham,
a classic, and he was on the more tame side. He had two wives
and concubines, but yes, two wives.
And that was Sarah and then Hagar, and then later he remarries after Sarah dies. So, what was I gonna say on David? Yes. So the fact that he glosses over is interesting. And I would say more clarity on this you can see in Abraham, because he had one wife, Sarah, and then because he didn't trust in God's promise, he went after Hagar, one of his concubines. So,
and now Sarah permitted it, but it doesn't mean, doesn't mean that it was a wise decision, obviously.
Yes.
In fact, it's not a wise decision because you know that Hagar son Ishmael ends up being a thorn in the side of the Israelites until the very day, because Ishmaelites are Arabs, and you may be familiar with the present state of affairs. Arabs don't usually like the Israelites very much for a multitude of reasons, but I think ultimately it's because of this original conception between the two peoples, right? Isaac and Ishmael.
Yes, so that brings up the interesting point that necessarily having multiple wives itself is not condemned, but there's always very strange outcomes that come from it, so hence why we do not support it.
Yes, so we will, again, I promise you, we will get to calling out the reasons not to be polygamous, but I do want to handle the scenarios that an atheist or even just any objector, a Mormon, for example, we all know Mormons famously were into polygamy, some still are. I would argue that it is still part of the Mormon religion, even if they don't practice it right now. I think the only reason they don't practice it right now is because the United States doesn't allow it. So we'll see. If the United States suddenly starts allowing it, we might see a change in Mormon theology once again. But if anybody comes to you objecting how Old Testament figures had multiple wives, the correct thing is not to whitewash it. If you ever read children's Bibles or see made-for-TV stuff like the Bible series from History Channel or whatever, you will never, I don't think I've ever seen multiple wives depicted ever. Like the little children's Bible, Jacob's wife is always Rachel. Hi. His first wife, who he's still married to, Leah, who has, what is it, four of the 12 Israelites? Anyways, has multiple sons. She's never in children's Bibles of every sort, and it's because nobody wants to talk about it. But I think if you're going to handle the full text, you have to know this is a practice. It was not condemned by God. It wasn't considered, like, he didn't give a command saying never commit polygamy. In fact, let's go to some more trouble here. So you talked about Abraham, father of the faith, clearly in heaven. Same with Jacob, in heaven. Isaac, all considered. Isaac
David as well.
David, man's after God's own heart, probably had 7 wives. I think that's the number. I could be wrong on that, but around 7 wives.
Yes.
Obviously multiple. He has not only Bathsheba, but also Abigail, who he gets from. I'm forgetting all my names now, but that foolish guy Naaman, right?
Yes.
And then also Saul's wife. Our daughter, Michal, right? Is that how you say her name? Whatever. I'm not going to.
Don't test the names.
And then he has Saul's wives, I believe, here, and then he may have had others. I'm forgetting all the wives that he possessed, but at least 3, 4, or 5.
You mentioned Josiah too. He had multiple. You mentioned Josiah had multiple wives.
Did I say that before? I don't know. It was a practice of Israelite kings, like any king anywhere, to have multiple wives because that was the practice to get many heirs, many potential heirs, I should say. So. I would think unless a king explicitly says he had one wife, he probably had multiple wives, and he almost certainly had concubines, which is a childbearing mechanism person, right? So we wouldn't put up with concubines today, and Christians wouldn't advocate for concubines today. So again, a practice that clearly was not... God doesn't call out Israel for having multiple wives. I can't think of any instance where he says, and you have multiple wives, and this I'm cursing you with this. However, I would be remiss if I didn't point out a line from Isaiah where God does use polygamy as a pointer towards the judgment he's bringing on Israel. And here it is. Isaiah 4:1. This is on... You're going to hear from me thing, but this is like, Israel's being judged. One of those, like, you'll eat your own babies kind of passages. He says this in Isaiah 4:1. On that day, 7 women will seize one man, saying, we will eat our own bread and provide our own clothing, but just let us be called by your name. Take away our disgrace. Okay? So judgment passes on Israel. This will happen if you don't obey God. It'll be terrible. Here is a instance of that terror. 7 women will come and beg to be married to one man, even if he doesn't provide for them at all. It doesn't give them bread, doesn't give them clothes. They just want to be married to him so that the disgrace of being unmarried can be taken away. I think this is insinuating that there's not a lot of men, and it's a disgrace for the women not to be married and to have no way to gain any wealth or property or children. So they were all begging just to be married to one man, even if he didn't provide for them. At least they had his name and the potential to have children. So it's a curse that a man... That they be in this situation where 7 men have to go to one woman. So clearly it is a curse to have this situation of many wives. So it's never endorsed by the Bible. Like, yes, go and take multiple wives. that's not like a good thing, right? And here it is being a bad thing, but it's also not a explicit sin. Once again, there's caveats to that, and we're going to talk about them, but I want to be plain with the text so that you don't end up in a situation where you thought everything was whitewashed and that Jacob only had one wife, when that's not the case. Another thing I wanted to bring up, and this will probably be the last thing I want to bring up as far as like pro-polygamy passages here, is the law. How would God's law treat marriage, specifically polygamy? How would there be lawful polygamy in Israelite times? One thing I'll say, if you the Bible, the law, God's law does not prohibit polygamy. Therefore, I think it would have been allowed for a man to have a wife and go and marry another. Now, I mean, how in the world is that going to play off with your wife? It would only cause like massive discord in the family. That's all I'll say. But and I would think the absolute driver of that man who's just going out to get another woman is lust, right? There's no way around that. And lust is obviously a sin in the Bible, right? And Jesus calls it adultery. And whoever lusts at a woman has committed adultery with her in his heart. So it's not punishable by death, adultery, but it is that same core sin. It's adultery at heart.
Yeah. So again, it brings strange results, and there's strange reasons behind it. So,
but let me give you a couple of examples where the marriage itself. So the marriage of so you're a man married to a wife, and you end up marrying another. How the marriage isn't the sin. The lust leading up to it might have been a sin. But here's an instance, a very controversial instance from the law in Deuteronomy. Let me pull it up. Deuteronomy 22:28. This is talking about, and again, context for this, you need a way, the law needs a way to figure out how to deal with people who have sex outside of marriage. Specifically because the father of the daughter has the right to a dowry, a payment from the should-be husband, and if some woman has sex outside of marriage, the daughter of the father has sex outside of marriage with some player, there needs to be some reconciliation. In the case of adultery, where the daughter is a married woman and then the person sleeping with her is another married guy and they're not married to each other, that's adultery. Both are to be stoned and put to death if somebody brings charges. So that's how the Bible deals with straight adultery. But this is the case, and I'm about to read God's law prescribing the case for if a man seduces a woman, rapes her, but it's not rape that she didn't want. So there is rape penalties in the Bible for if a woman is raped in a field, it specifically says, but it's kind of a euphemism for if nobody was able to even hear if she was resisting or not, and she has no excuse for, or she would have no ability to have witnesses to her resisting the rape, the man is to be put to death. So the Bible does not take rape lightly, but in the case that rape means that they just had consensual sex, essentially is what it's saying, this is the case. If a man, this is Deuteronomy 22, if a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, and again, this is in the city, if she had been resisting, people would have heard, so it's consensual sex. He shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, and because he's violated her, he can never divorce her as long as he lives. In this case, I would advocate that obviously they made a bad mistake out of lust. There's a penalty for it, a payment to the father, and a permanent marriage that cannot be divorced. But this man, if a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, he could have been married. I don't think there's any stipulation in this law that says that he is a virgin. So in the case that a man lusts after another woman, she's a virgin, they fornicate, right? And it's discovered, and then they have to marry. The marriage itself is actually prescribed by the law, even if he's already married. So say he has a wife or many wives, doesn't matter. He is prescribed to marry her if the father is willing, and then he pays the price and all this. Therefore, the marriage, the Polygamy Act, is not the sin. This is clearly a sin, right? The raping. Again, it's not rape in the modern sense, I would say. There is rape in the modern sense of the Bible, and it's condemned by death. This is just fornication outside of marriage. That's the sin. That's why it has a payment on earth, and of course it'll have a payment in the end. God doesn't tolerate any sin. All sin is worthy of death. But the sin isn't the polygamy here. The sin isn't the marriage. That's actually restitution for the sin. So there's a way that the polygamy instance would not actually be the unlawful thing. Of course, the lust that led up to it is. I've got one other one, and I think, did we already allude to it? That doesn't involve any sin, or could involve no sin. That is the one that the Sadducees brought up. So in the law, it is required for a brother, if his brother who is married dies having no offspring, he has the obligation to marry his sister-in-law and give his brother, his dead brother, a child, so that the line can be continued, not only for the sake of the line of the dead brother, but also for the woman herself, who's now destitute, and all the stuff that she would have had with her husband, the farmland or whatever else that might have come, it's now all out of her possession, because all the possessions actually would end up going back to the family, not to her. Because she doesn't have the right to inherit her husband's stuff, except in like super rare circumstances. So, in order to help the sister-in-law, and then also honor the memory of the dead brother, the law prescribes that his brother marry the sister-in-law, and at least bear her offspring enough that the line can be continued on. So at least one male child. And you see this sometimes in the Bible. Judah's son is wicked. He has a wife. The son's put to death by the Lord, doesn't have any children. So Judah marries his brother, so his son, but the brother of the dead son, to the wife. And then, of course, that son is wicked, and he also is put to death by the Lord. And so he ends up committing her to his third son, Judah does, who's not at marriageable age yet. And so they don't get married, and then he ends up not marrying her to him because I'm sure the son didn't want it, or Judah didn't want it, whatever. Maybe she was a piece of work. So she dresses up like a prostitute and has Judah sleep with her. And then Judah's like, whoops. I should have done that to begin with. Anyways, so obviously that's something we do today. In general, not advocating whether it's necessarily right or wrong, certainly weird to us. But in the law, it would not be sinful for a married brother, if his brother dies and he has a sister-in-law, he is obligated to marry her, to at least bear her offspring. That would be, therefore, in this situation, the brother would already have a wife. He would add the sister-in-law, so that'd be two wives, and it would be prescribed by the law. It would actually be a good thing. And in that case, again, polygamy is allowed. Now, is that ever the situation that Mormons are in? No. Or Islam or whatever. Think of all the polygamy examples we have today. I mean,
any cult, yeah.
I would eat my hat if that has even happened once in the last 1,000 years. But it is a way that the law, God's law, prescribes for polygamy possibly happening and not being a sin.
So keep in mind the context for that would have been that would have been very critical back in those days
to get married and have children,
especially if you have land and you're a farm, have a farm. So
yes,
yeah. So it makes sense why that was instituted back then.
Yes, and I'm trying to think, is there anything else we want to say? I know, there's some other characters that have multiple wives, and again, nothing as bad is said about their multiple wiveness. For example, Jacob has multiple wives. We already said that. Abraham, David, the father of Samuel, the prophet Samuel, Elkanah has two wives. And again, the Bible's not saying like, woo-hoo, yeah, he did it, he got two wives, good on him. But it just mentions it, doesn't condemn it in particular. Again, in the Old Testament, the only thing I can think of is the Isaiah 4:1 curse. It's clearly a curse of the polygamy, 7 wives to 1 husband kind of thing.
And we assume that the other kings of Israel did have multiple wives. We
do, and again, the law prescribes them not to have many wives, but many is not one. It doesn't restrict it to one. And David had multiple, and it wasn't considered he wasn't cursed because of his many wives. Solomon was. In fact, God says,
yes,
he's cursing Rehoboam. I'm going to split the kingdom because of Solomon's many wives and their foreign gods. That's the curse on him. So all that to say, I want to bring us into the New Testament because clearly, as I alluded to at the beginning of the episode, Christians are pretty much, and Jews in line with Christians, are the only movement across the entire spectrum that is for monogamy, besides like super short-lived, weird atheist philosophies. Today, atheism, I'm pretty sure by and large, is totally fine with no marriage, just sleeping whenever, or, it doesn't really matter. Like, marriage doesn't really matter to atheism. Why would it? Nothing matters. But of course, in Islam, multiple wives is fine. Any pagan religion I can think of, multiple wives is fine. Christianity is the only movement that I know of, really, that's into monogamy and enforces it. So why is that? If the Old Testament is like totally permissible, why do we take it, I think rightfully so, stances against polygamy and not allow it? I can only think of 1 or 2 strong texts from the New Testament. Do you have any on your mind, Sebastian? make you look it up. I haven't pulled up. You want me to? You want me to read the obvious one? I think
The one that comes to mind that's directly for monogamy is from Genesis. Quoted in the New Testament for Genesis.
Yeah, and that probably gets to the root of what our end position is going to be here. But do you have it, or should I quote it?
I do.
Okay.
Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh.
Yes, and the notable thing there, so that's of course in Genesis when God is prescribing.
And it's cited multiple times in the New Testament.
Yeah, and it's cited by Jesus specifically in the realms of divorce. So the Pharisees come to Jesus in Matthew 19, for example, and they say, "Teacher, is it permissible for a man to divorce his wife on any grounds?" And he tells them, he quotes Genesis, "Haven't you read, but that he who created them made them male and female?" So one, Jesus is saying that people are made male and female, in case there's any questions about that, separate issue. Then he also says, "And for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." Two become one flesh, as opposed to four become one flesh, or the man leaves his mother and father and becomes one with his wives. This is one wife, so clearly one man and one woman. And the Pharisees say, "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command us to give her divorce papers and send her away?" And Jesus told them, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because of the hardness of your hearts, but it was not like this from the beginning," right? And what God has joined together, let no one separate, right? So that principle that Jesus applies also applies to polygamy, I think, in that what God has joined together, one man and one wife, and no one separate, and no one add to, right? And it's one man and one wife. Moses permitted, Moses as in the law, like God permitted through Moses, polygamy and divorce. Because of the hardness of people's hearts, right? Because of mistakes, mostly. I mean, there's the scenarios we talked about where it might not be a sin, but most of the time it's a resultant of lust, right? Just excess lust. They go out and grab another woman. Moses permitted the multiple marriages, but it was because of the hardness of people's hearts. It was not like this from the beginning. And we see that from the beginning, it was Adam and Eve. That was the design, one man, one woman. And so the ideal and the enforced ideal from nations that build on Christian law is to have the ideal be the only permitted kind of marriage, that every other form of marriage leads to way too many problems and therefore isn't legitimate marriage. And so that's what the United States says, is what Europe says, and other countries that have been influenced by the Christian law, by Judeo-Christian law, whatever people want to say. God's law isn't as strict, so I don't know that we have to enforce what we do today, but I agree with what we enforce today, so I don't have a problem with polygamy laws saying that it should be illegal, because I believe it is dangerous and destroys families and children and people, and it's just generally terrible. So it is permitted in God's law, so there could be the argument that we should lift those laws here in the United States, but I would never advocate for polygamy. I mean, it's a disaster zone. When you think about Jacob, for example, Leah and Rachel hate each other. It's like a course for other discord amongst all the children. And the children of the concubines, like, they're always terrible. They're never a blessing, so same for Abraham. Abraham has concubines, and they have children, and they're not blessings. They're not even mentioned after they're born. Like, they don't end up as anything. Ishmael, of course, is a great curse against Isaac and his descendants. So polygamy is always a bad idea, and for this reason, might I add. So Jesus not only outlines this general principle that it's one man, one woman. Paul goes into probably the most relevant polygamy text. Yeah, for churches, rules for churches, and he says this in 1 Timothy about qualifications for elders. If you're not familiar, there's only two church offices really outlined in the Bible for people, and that is elder, and there's many words to that: overseer, presbyter, priest. Some call them priests, but whatever. It's overseer, elder, and deacon. Okay, so like big boy and little boy. So some might call that pastor and deacon because they don't have a weird name for deacon. Whatever your case is, I believe in a multi-elder church. We have multiple elders and multiple pastors that lead a church, and then deacons are, even more than that, and just everybody that serves at a church. Some people believe in like a single monarchical episcopate, one pastor, one presbyter, one priest, whatever. I don't agree with that.
That's how we got the Pope.
That's how you get the Pope, right? But whatever. That's how things work out, right? One elder, big boy, and then a bunch of deacons, little boys. The qualifications for both of those positions from Paul go like this, and he tells Timothy. In 1 Timothy 3, he says, "The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to be in the office of overseer," that's that elder position, "he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not lover of money. And it goes on and goes on. Not, knows how to manage his household well and keeps dignity with his children being submissive. All these different qualifications again. The notable one clearly for us is he says, therefore an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. And so I would hold to, and Christians across the world, as far as I'm aware, Orthodox Christians, that is normal Christians, believe that an elder must be a husband of one wife. Mm-hmm. If you have a man who is either has illegitimately divorced his wives and then married others, so for example, he divorced one because he didn't like the way she looked and he married another, he's committed adultery, he would be disqualified from eldership. Similarly, and we don't see this much in the United States, but I'll tell you it's a huge issue in Africa, and that's why we're even talking about this. If you have a man that joins the church and he has multiple wives, even if the church didn't permit, didn't recognize the other marriages, like when it happened, right? Say he comes from Islam, which is the reason it's huge in Africa is because Islam is a huge presence in Africa, and in places where Islam and Christianity hit, like Nigeria and a lot of West Africa, there are many men, not many, but there are men who come from Islam. They convert from Islam to Christianity. They have multiple wives because Islam is supportive. In fact, sometimes they mandate it, get multiple wives. He comes into Christianity, he's in the church, and he has multiple wives, and he wants to be an elder. The question becomes for that church, and it's super relevant there because it happens today, and it's an obvious question. Can I be an elder in the church because I'm not the husband of one wife, I'm the husband of 3 or 4 or 2? I believe this text is clear that the elder cannot be a husband of multiple wives. And so therefore, somebody with multiple wives is restricted, cannot be an elder. But I should point out, and I think it's in line with God's law and what we were saying about the Old Testament before, I don't think the polygamy itself is a constant state of sin. I don't believe that the man with multiple wives, there might have been sin involved in gaining the wives, but now that he is married with wives, it is not a sin to have multiple wives, and therefore the answer should not be, and African churches have to ask this question, and it's a legitimate question, the answer should not be, well, now that I'm a Christian, should I divorce all my wives, save one, that way I can be elder, like am I sinning and having multiple wives? And a lot of people scratch their heads on that and think, is that's a really hard question. Should we divorce the wives to be right with God?
Save it.
Okay.
Save it for the discussion because that's how we actually apply it.
Okay. So something put a pin in it. Huh? Anyways, this is the text I would quote, and I think that this shows, and this is the text that Western Christianity and in Christianity everywhere it goes has used to advocate against polygamy. Because if you want to be in good standing and able to be an elder, you have to be a husband of one wife, and therefore be a husband of one wife. Don't have multiple marriages. Of course, Catholic Church doesn't recognize multiple marriages. Protestant churches don't recognize multiple marriages, not in this country. The state doesn't recognize multiple marriages. If you want some of the history of this nation, the Republican Party, when they first started in 1856, first ran, I should say, they ran on a platform of eliminating 2 grave evils in the United States. Slavery, obviously, and polygamy. Because at the time, the Mormons were a big hot-button issue because they were out in Utah looking to become a state, but the United States, some in the United States didn't have a problem. They're like, yeah, okay, let them join the Union like anybody else would. But many Christians in the United States said, no, we will never permit such an evil cult group joining the United States as a state. So the Republicans were of the party, we will not hit Utah, and if they keep polygamy. And of course, Abraham Lincoln ends up winning in 1860. He's the first Republican to win. Same platform, eliminate slavery, eliminate polygamy, and eventually the United States only permits Utah to join once they've eliminated polygamy. So this nation has a practiced use of disallowing polygamy, for what it's worth. Any other scripture that I'm missing, Sebastian, before we talk about history of polygamy and some of its applications like we alluded to?
I think those are the main 2 that we want to go to, how it actually applies to us today. And then, obviously, I just wanted to save it for discussion for how it applies in Africa, because it's a big issue. Not just from Islam. Well, I have a couple of things from Islam, but also from, it could be cults, and also from the traditional religions in Africa. They do allow for multiple wives. So, Again, a big dilemma in Africa.
Okay, so all that said, we've gone through a lot of the Bible stuff. Let's talk about how it has applied in the world. And again, we've already said atheists or whoever is complaining that Christianity is hypocritical and allows for polygamy. I don't think it is. That we support monogamy and say it is the best way to marry, and that you are making a mistake if you marry multiple. In case you are, unless you argue that you're like your brother's redeemer and you are marrying his wife because he didn't have children. I mean, who would ever do that? I don't think that's ever the case for people having multiple wives, but whatever. I mean, barring those kind of situations where it might be trickier, I don't think it's hypocritical for Christians to look down their nose at polygamy and disallow it and want it to be outlawed. That being said, Christianity is the driving force of monogamy in the world, so I think it's completely dismissible, the atheist case on that front. However, let's talk about the history of the world and get kind of an image for why it's even an important issue today. So in history, of course, you're aware, ancient Israelites were having multiple wives. Now, it's expensive to have multiple wives because you're expected to take care of them. It's another person in the household to take care of, all that. So most people did not have multiple wives, even when it didn't have such a cultural stigma against it. That's why it was really a king's thing to have multiple wives, or like a really big patriarch with a lot of money. Kind of like, rich people today usually don't have just one marriage, but that's for different reasons. That being said, throughout the pagan times, like Roman times, there were senators and important people, governors, kings that had multiple wives, but again, it was like a rich status symbol. And so, it's never been common practice for large portions of society to have multiple wives because it's really untenable. As it turns out, because God made it to be one man and one woman, 50% of people are women, 50% of people are men. So if one man marries two women, the ratio is now double men to women, double men to women, right? So if you have everybody trying to take two wives, every man trying to take two wives, you will run out. Only 50% of people will be able to take two wives.
And the rest will be very sad.
And if you increase the number to 3, you get a giant problem. So let's talk about some of the scenarios. So in history, it's not super common to be polygamous, but there are things that have promoted it, namely Islam. Do you want to talk about Islam?
I do, and also I want to mention a few examples worth mentioning because before you say Roman Empire, Egypt, Assyria, Middle East area, sure, Africa, traditional religions there too, Islam. Also, in East Asia, let's not leave them out of the picture because before you say this is a Western problem, no, it's not. In China, it was normal for the emperor to have many, many concubines like Solomon.
Like multiple wives.
Yeah. And from what I was reading on history of Korea, it was also okay for the Korean
Japan,
kings.
In Vietnam. Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere.
Everywhere. So, and it is usually not good when that happens because it has very weird and deranged results at times. So one example I want to give this one for could resist for polygamy when cults they go bonkers. So it's not just in Islam there's polygamy, but for whatever reason cults they like polygamy. Means the rebellion in Munster
they're like, okay, we're rebelling. This is a reform thing. We've talked about that, right? Haven't we?
A little bit, yes.
In any case, reformed group of
Anabaptists.
Anabaptists, but heretic Anabaptists immediately were like, okay, yeah, we're going to be different. And one of the first things we changed from the Bible is the polygamy. Like, let's do it. It's required, actually. So it's good.
Yeah, so one of the leaders, John Mathis, he considered a prophet. And then there's also there was also another man with him. They went around naked in the city. They took multiple wives. So clearly not very stable people. And the rebellion in Munster ended in disaster. So,
well, I think the motivation behind cults having polygamy suddenly allowed, ruled by one big man, might be super obvious in that the man just wants to have sex with multiple women. So he's like, okay, I'm making the rules. We're going to have multiple wives. And you see that in, I'm just going to straight offend everyone. You see that in Islam. He's just like, yep, multiple wives. You heard it here first, folks. In fact, I'm the prophet. Have I mentioned that? And then Mormonism, same exact thing. He's like, yo, your wife, now my wife. Also, God says it's okay. In fact, he requires it, so give me the wife, right? And same for other cults like that, like the one you just mentioned in the Middle Ages, but it's happened other times before. I know other polygamous cults in the United States of like weird origin, kind of like Mormonism, equally had similar single guys like, yep, it's actually okay to have multiple women, particularly for me. Isn't that convenient? Anyway, so I think the motivation is clear there. But Islam is probably the biggest pusher of polygamy outside of like pagan beliefs of random tribes.
Yeah, so let me cite that. I mentioned that this is the most common one mentioned, and then also commented by Hadith, which in our Islamic episode. Check that out for more information. What a Qadi is, a judge, Islamic judge. It's from chapter 4, An-Nisa. Give orphans their wealth when they reach maturity, and do not exchange your worthless possessions for their valuables, nor cheat them by mixing their wealth with your own, for this would indeed be a great sin. If you fear you might fail to give orphan women their due rights, if you were to marry them, then marry other women of your choice, 2, 3, or 4. But if you are afraid you will fail to maintain justice, then content yourself with one or those bondwomen, concubines, in your possession. This way you are less likely to commit injustice.
Now, I have to say, the Quran's not super clear. I don't like the way it reads, but that is the passage that Muslims use today for advocating that they allow for 4 wives, like you heard from that thing. Some sects advocate for multiple women. Like, if you are able, you should, as opposed to just you're able to. But in any case, Muslims allow up to 4 wives. So that's the practice in West Africa. It's the practice in the Middle East if they can afford it. So it's just the practice. It's Sharia law.
Yes, exactly. So this is the one that they use, and then the judges, they comment on that. So depending on the school of jurisprudence, for more information in schools, please check our episode on Islam. Some say it is better to have just one, and others are like, it's okay. We can have up to many. So some say it's more convenient to have just one, just for the sake of justice, which is part of the problem that we've been alluding to, that it is unjust on the women to you having multiple of them just around, and they're going to fight each other, and it's going to be a mess, and it's going to be chaotic. So better not to do it. One example, as you were mentioning, Michael, that Muhammad said, "I am a prophet, so give me all these women," was for his adopted son, Said. When Muhammad sees his wife, she is undressing herself, and then suddenly the next day he has a revelation from Allah saying that Allah says, divorce her and give her to me. So, and then also we have the famous example of Aisha, his child bride, and also he also a harem of other women as well. So, my speculation, I think he kind of wanted to have all those women around, but that's just my humble opinion.
Maybe, yeah, it might be it. Anyways, yeah. I think that's what you're going to. That's why polygamy is relevant today, because it's really not practiced very much today, outside of that, and again, select groups of Mormons that we should probably talk about now too. But anyways, when you're going to run into polygamy, it's probably going to be either in the African context for people coming out of Islam, or, I mean, if possible, maybe one of these tribal people when you're interacting with some weird tribal person. African Christianity is actually much more relevant than you might think, especially as American, because Africa is growing so exponentially fast, not only population, but also in Christian population. Mm-hmm. So it's probably going to be the center population of Christianity in the next 30 years or so. So within most of our lifetimes, it's going to be bigger than the United States, bigger than Asia, bigger than Europe, as far as like the center of Christianity, bigger than South America. And so their issues will suddenly be very topical. And so that's one of their big issues in West Africa. And so I think we should be knowing about it. Plus the fact here, who knows what the West will do as far as marriage goes. So, it might be an issue in 30 years here, as far as having multiple wives.
Yeah, so then let's narrow down on that example exactly. The best example where you can see this being applied is Nigeria, because if you see at a map, it's half and half. The north half, actually, if you look at like half and half, mm-hmm. middle of the country, north half, mostly Muslim, like 99% Sunni, with some random Christians here and there. The south, you have whatever Christian, Anglican, Reformed, Catholic, etc., you name it. So, with a few Muslims in there. So, sprinkle with a few Muslims in there. So, in those middle lines, you have the interaction between two groups. You're going to have people leaving Christianity. You're going to have people coming from Islam to Christianity. And most radical groups in Islam, like, for example, Boko Haram, which is from...
Their terrorist group? Yeah.
Yes, terrorism. And also groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, in different all these extremist groups, they like promising the warriors to have multiple wives as treasure, yep. So bounty, which is another example from the Quran in which Muhammad says, take these wives as wives, as captives, but not just one, implying multiple. And there is a possibility of someone who was in Boko Haram, who has taken all these women as captives or however he acquired them, and now has repented and turned bowed the knee to Christ. So what does he do?
Yeah. And again, well, maybe we should still put the pin in it, because
yes, getting excited. Yes,
getting
getting excited.
I'm already alluding to what my opinions are. The other one, so the one you'll find in the United States. So if the United States doesn't go crazy yet, at least within our lifetimes, and doesn't start allowing multiple marriages everywhere, there are a particularly famous group, LDS Church, the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, used to require polygamy. Brigham Young changed it, but they used to require polygamy for salvation. That was a principle of the Mormon Church. It's all about celestial marriage, and when you're in heaven, you'll have the same wives that you had on earth, and you want to produce as many children as possible, and therefore, if you actually want to be godhood in your next life, which is all the Mormon theology, of course it's false, that you have to be polygamous, because you can't just have one wife, you won't make enough babies, you won't be a good god, and therefore it was required to have multiple wives to enter into heaven. However, when the United States, under the leadership of the Republicans, like I just alluded to, said you're never entering the United States if you stay polygamous, in fact, alluding we might actually invade you and overthrow your government when we get to you. When we're moving over there, we might just invade you and throw you out. They decided, they got new revelation from the heavens that polygamy is no longer required. In fact, it was outlawed. You can't do it anymore. Only in heaven will there be polygamy, they say, not on earth, because of reasons that have nothing to do with the United States government forcing them to do it. In any case, some Mormons, as you might imagine, said, "What's that? We're capitulating to the U.S. government. That's not good." And so the mainstream Latter-day Saints do not permit polygamy right now. Again, that might change in the future, but this is not their permission right now. However, there were several splinter groups that split off the Mormons at that moment and decided to keep polygamy. One of the most famous ones is the FLDS, the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. There's also like RLDS, Reformed LDS. There's a couple of splinter groups that do this. But the FLDS famously have polygamous cults like in Mesa, Arizona and other places where they practice polygamy today. Now, under U.S. law, you're not allowed to actually officially marry multiple wives. You can only have one wife. So typically these men in these cults will have one official wife and then multiple other unofficial wives. And you were asking me before this episode, Sebastian, what do I think, like if that person were to convert, if the Mormon guy were to convert and he'd have all these wives, would we treat him like the guy in Nigeria who like officially has 4 wives, say, and then converts? And I'm just going to spoil. I would say don't divorce those wives, save for the regular reasons to divorce wives. Should we treat the guy in the FLDS with multiple wives the same way, even though he isn't formally married to have her, the unofficial wives? I would think yes, depending on how the marriage was done.
Precisely, because I'm of the mind that there has to be some backup. There has to be some substance to this marriage. Was it done in secret? Is it recognized by either a government or by the church? That's what's my questions are.
Yeah, and I'm going to agree with Sebastian. I think there are some sleazeballs, for the record, total sleazeballs, but some people say like, "Oh, babe, just me and you. Like, we don't have to like sign any papers, man. It's just between you, me, and God. We're getting married right now, spiritual marriage." And then they sleep together, and it's just to sleep together and live together, whatever. But they never, like, they call themselves married or whatever, but they're not. They never did a ceremony. They never had witnesses. They never signed a contract of anything, and they certainly didn't get the state to recognize it. So I think the state recognizing it is in a way to officiate marriage, yes. I don't think it's the only way. So say the United States, what if the United States didn't recognize marriage at all? Like they never gave a yes or no whether you were married or not, which I may even advocate for, considering they call things that aren't marriage today, so maybe they should just get out of it entirely. I still think you can have official marriage as long as there were 2 to 3 witnesses. I think the Bible has a standard that requires contracts to be seen by 2 or 3 witnesses so that you can bring that person to court should they violate the contract. And marriage is essentially just a contract between a man and a woman to stay faithful to each other and to raise children and all that. Whatever entails a marriage. I think you need marriage to be viewed by 2 or 3 witnesses other than, of course, yourself or God or whatever excuses you might make. So if in the FLDS church there was a ceremony in which there was 2 to 3 witnesses and it was a full, like, this is a marriage contract, I believe it's a legitimate marriage and therefore shouldn't be broken up should that person come to Christ. That's what I would think. Just like the Boko Haram guy in Nigeria, I would think they are wives. Now, of course, all the same stipulations about divorce apply as well.
Mm-hmm.
In that if someone is sexually immoral, husband or wife, they have the right to divorce in the Bible, and that's a proper grounds for divorce. Some would argue that, but that's what I would say, that it is proper grounds for divorce to divorce on sexual morality. Same for the Boko Haram guy. But as far as you want to stay, like everybody wants to stay together, I think you should. You don't need to force them to leave. Kind of like Paul says, if an unbelieving spouse wants to stay with you, then let them stay with you. You shouldn't force them away.
All right. And you were saying you need witnesses for a marriage?
Yeah, even in this, take God's law out of things for a second. Even if you just look at the United States law, we require witnesses for even if you just go to the courthouse and you want to get your marriage thing signed, so you don't use a pastor, you don't do any of the formal stuff, they still require a witness of the contract being signed.
What more witnesses do you need? You have the
you have
Trinity,
baby. It's right there. Yeah, that's not.
You have Melchizedek, Enoch.
Yes.
Like,
God is a witness, but you can't call him as a witness on the witness stand, so it's not lawfully married. I don't.
What a shame.
What a shame. So in all those cases, if you ever meet somebody who's after the us, if you just meet some weird sexual revolution person who believes in polygamy or polyandry or whatever else they might pull, or if you are hearing arguments from Africa, or you meet somebody from Africa who's encountered this, that's when you have to know where the Bible stands in this. And even if an atheist just points out the quote unquote hypocrisy of polygamy, I think we should stand on the biblical grounds and not just be like, I hate polygamy, God would never allow for polygamy. We have to understand what the text actually says. That way we're not shocked and shaken when we see instances of polygamy being allowed by God in the Old Testament. All that being said, maybe I should give my final. I mean, I already gave my opinion on these Boko Haram people, but I would say one of the big questions that comes up in Africa is,
can they lead?
Can they be an elder? So going back to the 1 Timothy question, 1 Timothy 3, where it says the elders must be above reproach, and the husband of one wife. Does the Boko Haram guy say, well, should I divorce all but one of my wives so that I can be an elder, because being an elder is a good thing? I would say no, because God hates divorce. And again, there are proper ways to divorce, but it's not because you become a Christian. It's not because they're unbelievers or of any change like that. It's only for sexual morality or death. Therefore, I do not believe that it would be righteous for the husband to suddenly divorce all but one of his wives so that he can be an elder. Instead, and I don't believe he's living in sin. Like some of these things that are requirements for eldership, if you aren't them, you are sinning, and you might still be being sanctified. For example, it says don't be a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome. Like, okay, if you're quarrelsome or a drunkard or not sober-minded or whatever, these things are sins, right? And they need to be worked on in and of themselves. You're actively sinning when you're a drunkard. However, being a polygamist, I don't believe is an active sin. It's actually permitted by God. It's allowed. You're not in active sin for being a polygamist, and therefore you don't have to get rid of the state. It's not the best state. It's kind of like losing your leg is not preferable. I would not recommend going around chopping off your leg. And if you chopped off your leg, I think there's a sin involved there. But now that the leg is gone, you're not in a perpetual state of sin because you've lost your leg. Same thing with polygamy. I don't advocate for polygamy. It's like chopping off your leg, right? You're like doing a disservice to yourself when you do that, to everyone involved. But once you're in it, it would be evil to divorce them.
And ditch them,
right? So same goes to the people in Boko Haram. I believe that as a person who is now a Christian but has multiple wives or whatever happened that you ended up with multiple wives, you just aren't permitted to be an elder. And it's it's not the end of the world. Just like, in fact, one of the requirements for being an elder in this same passage is able to teach. It's not a sin to not be able to teach. In fact, I mean, normal people, plenty of normal people are not able to teach, and so they would not be permitted to be an elder because they aren't good teachers, and that's fine. That's just a role they aren't to do. Women are permitted to be elders, and it's not a sin to be a woman, as it turns out. It's just not in their role. So same for these people who have multiple wives. It's just not their role to be an elder in the church. I would think, now this is much more controversial actually. I would think this passage also bars single people like myself or Sebastian from being an elder until you're married. I think the requirements for elder are that you're married so that, my insinuation is so that they can minister to people who are married and people who aren't married, because they of course have been single and now are married. And there's some maturity to being married and some balance. I think that's why it is the requirement for eldership here. I know many believing and smart Christians, Dr. James White would disagree, and he believes that single men are also allowed to marry. sorry, not yeah, they're allowed to marry, to be elders. But that one I'll agree to disagree. I think the polygamy people should not. I don't think most people would say, yeah, you're not allowed to be an elder, but don't divorce your wives.
And I would say I wholeheartedly agree. And I'm also saying that here, as to be an elder, it's important because a significant part of the congregation will be married. There's a lot of people in the world that do marry, so you, as a pastor, as a leader, you have to understand, you have to relate, be able to relate, and be able to advise these people. So that's why it's important. And if it's more than one wife, you just don't meet the requirements. You're able to serve. We hold that everyone who's called by God fits in the body of the church.
Yeah.
While I enjoy doing charity and helping others, there are people who are much, much more passionate than me, and I think that is their calling for the Lord. Likewise, I think that better preachers, I'm not able to preach. Thus, there are people who has their calling. For learning, studying, I think that is somewhere where I do it better than others. For example, in Greek or church history, you name it, etc. Most people don't have an interest in that. So that's how I see myself, being able to help other people in the church if they need resources, information, whatever it may be, or learning new things, whatever it may be. Likewise, if you're in this situation that we were describing, you just converted and you came from a belief system that allowed you to have multiple spouses, then it's God knows where you came from. So it's you will be able to assist in other forms.
Mm-hmm. I think we'd also be remiss if we ended the episode before just giving a brief synopsis of what the good side of marriage is. So if polygamy has its problems, the good side of marriage is that you have one partner, right? You can be of one flesh. It's a gift. Do you have text on it?
Yes. Okay. Wow, this is such a great from Ecclesiastes, one of my favorite books.
Okay, I've quoted.
Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up the other. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him.
Yeah. There's another line in that one. I don't know if you have it pulled up. It's a funny one. So I hear this one quoted from marriage all the time, and I think it's applicable because two's better than one, and you partner, your spouse is your partner, and you stand. But notice, I think it can be applied to marriage in that way, but I don't think Ecclesiastes is specifically talking about marriage in that statement, because the next line, I'm pretty sure, because I saw this one when I was looking up quotes for this episode, and the very next line, I believe, is a cord of two or three is not easily broken. It's like, okay. So if it was specifically about marriage, it's like, oh yeah, and then add the second wife in. So I think it's just like people in general, like having a partner. I know there's that thing about lying together, but I don't think it's sexual. I think it's just, just a thing. So yeah,
what a
commonly quoted at weddings, by the way, funnily enough.
You burst my bubble.
But I mean, it's still applicable, because having a partner in general is good, and a wife or a husband, depending on who you are, is obviously a partner, and it's good. Now, we all know statements from Jesus and from Paul himself that say, and Jesus himself says, there are eunuchs who are born that way from their mother's womb. There are eunuchs who made that way by man, and there are eunuchs who make themselves that way for the sake of the kingdom. Let anyone who is able to understand it accept it. So clearly, it is not a bad thing to be single. So it's not like the ultimate goal to be married or anything like that for everyone, right? But it's the normative, and it is the normal way that God has made humanity, right? He saw the man was alone and said it's not good for me to be man alone, and brought a wife. So again, not everyone is called to be married, but it is a normal course, and there are good things with marriage. Again, one of them is in the flavor of that Ecclesiastes text, despite the two or three chords in the end of it there, that you have a partner to go along with. Also, of course, children are born out of marriage typically. Which is a gift from God. Also, you're edified, I think, by having somebody else that's so close to you. So without marriage, you don't usually have another person that is that close to you, by all the intimacies of marriage. And so it's somebody who tests you. I think the biggest thing that married couples typically say that I hear Christians is that it's a big test, and it edifies you. It makes you think about things other than yourself more than you would otherwise. I'm not saying marriage is the only way to do that, but I think it's a big way to do that, being edified. So I think there's a lot of gain out of true marriage, and it's already a difficult enough thing. Multiple spouses, polyandry or polygamy, you're only complicating things. Of course, polyandry, I believe, is just a straight sin. There's no examples of that we'd even point to. But polygamy, even if you've convinced yourself that, this time it'll be different, God's original design is for one man and one woman. So I don't know, you think you know better than God? I would not go there. It's kind of like eating a million candy bars or cutting off your leg, saying, I don't like this leg here. I would look so much better with just one leg. God made you with two legs. It's the normal course for humanity to have two legs. Now, sometimes people are born with one leg, and it's not a problem if they're born with one leg, like that they sinned or something like that. But cutting off your one leg because you think it looks better to have just one leg instead of two is bad for you, and that's why polygamy is bad for you. Yes, it's permitted, but it's not good. It's not useful.
Mm-hmm.
And so real marriage is between one man and woman, and it's good. It's a gift from God. And that's the general Christian line, and that's why the Christian world and the Christian church has been the advocate for strong, monogamous, true, good, building up marriage that has benefited the world. I think probably the family unit is stronger, I think, than any worldly government. Of course, Jesus' government is over the family. It's over the worldly governments, but I think strong families make strong nations as opposed to strong nations making strong families.
Agreed.
And that is why we serve the one and only true living Lord Jesus Christ, who has one wife, and that's the church. He's not polygamous. He has one wife. It's the church. Some might say, "Oh, there's like a billion members there," but obviously he's not married to me. He's married to the church as a whole. Okay, yes. we serve the Lord Jesus Christ, and we call ourselves the Found Cause because we've been found our cause in serving that Lord Jesus Christ. I've been Michael, the man behind the machine, and to my left has been.
No, to your right, Sebastian, the bookkeeper.
To them, it's the left.
Yes.
To me, it's your right. Yeah. Thanks for listening. If you want to see the rest of our episodes, you can go to foundcause.podbean.com and download them all for your listening pleasure. You can also go to iTunes or Spotify and download them there, or listen to them, stream them there 3 times speed, whatever you want. I would recommend that you go to YouTube or Facebook, though. Facebook.com/foundcause or YouTube, and you have to search us in the search bar because our videos are there, and we do most of our episodes in video now. I don't think there's been one that we've done non-video in a while. Sometimes we have cool graphics. Today we don't. Leave us a like, subscribe, whatever you do. Until next time, when we talk about something completely different. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.